Hi everyone. So today we're going to finish the classical period, and then after this lecture, I am going to ask you to maybe take a short test to see how much you understood. So I would like you to continue to take, while watching this video, maybe continue to take notes in your notebook, just to see how much you understand. You might have to stop the video, or you can listen to the video more than once to make sure that you understand. So to review, let's start. So the classical style was different than the Baroque style in that the Baroque style was almost too much ornamentation and decoration, and in the classical style there was kind of this return to an emphasis of clarity, which was like kind of a greater focus on homophony, where there's one melody or motif that is supported by the harmony. You see in this period simple, regular phrases of music, and that, as I said last week, a lot of this was due to there was this increased wealth for the common people. So there was a lot more musicians, and they weren't able to play the difficult music of the Baroque period. And so there was this need for simpler pieces that were easier to play. But there was also the development of music became structural, meaning that we see this evolution, like music is telling a story. So as in the Baroque period, there was this kind of repeated imitation of this melody. We see in the classical period this kind of evolution of this movement of a motif, the use of motifs that kind of change throughout the piece rather than a repeating melody. So the difference between a melody and a motif is that a melody stays the same as constantly repeated through a piece, but a motif evolves during the composition so that by the end, the first motif and the last motif might be quite different. Okay, so the first composer that we're going to look at, I think we talked about him last week, was Joseph Haydn. Again, he was maybe the father of this period. So if we look at Joseph Haydn, as I think we said last week, he was born in Austria. He worked in the court of Esterhazy for 24 years. He was the father of different musical genres called like the string quartet and the symphony. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. He was known as Papa Haydn because he was a great supporter of musicians. He was friend to Mozart, and I think he was a teacher of Beethoven, who are the other composers that we're going to study today. And he started off in the court of Esterhazy for 24 years. He had a patron, and he composed a lot of music for him. And then eventually he moved to London and became a freelance composer. I think the thing that Haydn is most well known for is the development of the sonata form, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. As I said, when he worked in Esterhazy, he had his own orchestra, and he composed many operas every week, or not many operas, but many different forms of music every week. In the end, he wrote over 100 symphonies, 60 piano sonatas, 68 string quartets. So he developed a lot of he composed a lot of different kinds of music. And mostly the way that he was able to do this was through development of a song structure called sonata form. So first, let's introduce the sonata. So the sonata is a song form. It's a 3 or 4 movement composition for solo instrument that explores a motif. So, we see this common motif that develops throughout the course of 3 or 4 different movements, and it's usually for a solo instrument, usually piano or violin. Each movement has 3 large sections. We have an exposition, which is the introduction of the motif. We have a development in which the motif kind of changes, and the key actually changes, moves from the tonic, which is the root key, to the fifth, which is chords built on a 5 notes above the tonic. And then we have a recapitulation at the end where the motif is restated to kind of, and then the piece ends. So this is exposition, development, and recapitulation. So the sonata was originally, as I said, it's a piece for solo instrument that explores a motif, but this structure was used in other composition. For example, in symphonies and string quartets, when Haydn wrote this, he used the same structure called sonata form. So originally it was for a solo instrument, but eventually this structure called sonata form was applied to his symphonies and his string quartets. Again, it would be the exploration of a motif in 3 or 4 movements, but instead of a solo instrument, it would be a symphony or a string quartet. So if you look here, here's an explanation of sonata form in more detail. We have the exposition, which introduces the motif, the development in which the motif evolves, and then the recapitulation in which the motif is restated. So we can see here is an exposition here on the bottom, and then theme 1, and it changes a little bit, and then it goes to theme 2, and then it's repeated, and then there's the development of that theme in usually a different key change, and then there's a return to the original theme, and then another transition, and then it ends. So anyways, you just need to know that this is what sonata form is. So in the Baroque period, we had the fugue was the main song form. Here, the main song form in the classical period is the sonata form, and this was how this structure was basically how Haydn was able to compose so many pieces. It's kind of like the sonata form is like a template, a word template that, if you have this template, you can, fit in things really a lot easier. So this structure helped Haydn compose much more easily, and through this structure, he was able to compose a lot more music. So the listening example 1, I'm not going to play the listening examples. I would like you to go listen. So I would like you to go to Weebly, SUAC English in Weebly, and listen to the Symphony number 104 and try to notice the clarity of texture, the simplicity. It starts off quite slow, but it changes. You can see there's changing moods. It starts off kind of serious and sad, but then it becomes very light. And you can see that there's these short motific ideas instead of these repeating melodies. So please listen to this. And please remember that Haydn was one of the earliest composers of the symphony. Again, he was working in Esterhazy, he was very busy, and he composed many symphonies, over 100 of them. And he used the sonata form to compose these symphonies. Haydn was also the first composer to compose for 4 instruments called the string quartets. String quartet is 2 violins, a viola, which is a slightly larger violin, and it has a deeper tone, and then a cello. And again, these his compositions for the string quartets, he wrote many of them, were sonata form, development of a motif in 4 movements. So if you go to the listening example number 2, you can hear the first movement from the Emperor string quartet. And you can notice in it, this should be number 2, listening example number 2 on Weebly. You'll notice a clear texture, that the music is kind of a conversation between the different instruments, that they're bouncing back at da 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 da. So, and there's these kind of these motificate ideas that are bouncing back and forth. All right, let's move on to Mozart. Mozart was born in Salzburg, Vienna. He wrote his first sonata at 6 and his first opera at 14. He was kind of a great performer, and he was right away. He had a musical family, and his sister was also a musical genius, and they would tour around Vienna as these performers. They would play keyboard and violin. Again, he could write music very early on, and he would make his own compositions. Even though he died at 35 years of age, he composed 600 works. They say that Mozart, he heard this music in his head, and he composed very easily. One of the greatest geniuses of music of all time. And one of the things that he popularized was the piano concerto, which is an orchestra plus a piano, and the orchestra and the piano play back and forth. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later. This is an example, Mozart listening number 3. is the Marriage of Figaro. Again, this is the overture, if you remember from the last unit. This is the instrumental overture at the beginning of an opera to tell people, listen, sit down, we're going to start. And Mozart was very well known for these overtures. They were very famous and very, really amazing pieces of music. So please listen to this. An interesting story about this is that Mozart wrote this. He wrote the whole opera and they practiced it, but he forgot to write down, he wrote it in his head, but he forgot to write down the overture. And so he had to write it down very quickly right before the first performance of the Marriage of Figaro in 1786. It just shows what a genius he was, that he could write things in his head and forget to write them down. But of course, the musicians needed to have a paper copy.
Okay, now I would like to go to one more listening example, or two more actually. These are examples. Please go to the Weebly English SUAC website and check out the fourth and the fifth examples in the classical period section. This is Mozart's Requiem. So Mozart wrote a mass for the dead. So a requiem is like a mass, but it's a mass for when a famous person died. So he was commissioned to make this requiem, and he actually never finished it. He died in the middle of it, and his student actually had to finish it. And then it was eventually played at Mozart's funeral after. So it was completed. Now, the Mozart is a series of, like a mass, the Requiem is a series of texts in Latin that are set to music. Actually, many composers have written requiems, but Mozart's Requiem is probably the most famous, and it is one of the very first examples of a Requiem. Actually, personally speaking, I actually sang Mozart's Requiem when I was in university in a choir of 200 people. We performed it. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. So please listen to this example and imagine, there's a choir of hundreds of people singing this at full volume with an orchestra, and you can imagine the impact of this work. The Kyrie was actually one of the parts of the Requiem that was completed by Mozart before he died, and it is actually a fugue, one of the rare instances of fugues that Mozart wrote. Mozart actually heard a concert by Bach when he was a boy and was amazed and influenced by Bach. But as I said, sonata form, and the sonata was the more dominant song form of this period. But that didn't stop Mozart from using techniques from other composers. The example number 5 is Dies Irae. It means Day of Anger, and it's a very interesting example of how anger is shown in music. You can see that if you're bad, God will punish you, and it's like Dies Irae. So please listen to that as well. All right. Now we're going to move on to Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was a little bit later. Beethoven was a virtuoso German pianist from a young age. He would tour around Europe, was well known as a performer. He was born in Bonn, Germany, and he worked for patrons. He had patrons when he was younger. He actually worked for princes and royalty. But eventually he couldn't work well with them because they were constantly trying to control him. And eventually he became a freelance composer. He would compose concerts for himself or by himself, and then charge tickets for his concerts. Eventually, because of the loudness of he was constantly with surrounded by loud music, he eventually lost his hearing, and he had to. He would clutch a stick in his mouth and hold the stick onto the piano, and he could hear through what was called bone conduction, which is a technique to hear through the vibrations. And actually that technology is used now. They make bone conduction headphones now that allow you to hear music, but you can also hear everything around you. So anyway, that he lost his hearing, but he continued to compose by through this method of listening to vibrations. One of the characteristics of Beethoven is that he acted as a bridge composer to the next Romantic period. The early, for example, the early symphonies by Beethoven were very, very similar to Haydn and Mozart, but he got and eventually his style changed. He started to break all of his own rules, and it led into this kind of free-form Romantic period. So, for example, the late string quartets, or if you listen to his ninth and final symphony, it is very, very of a very different style, and that style was built upon by other composers in the Romantic period. Unfortunately, we're not going to talk about the Romantic period, but just for your own influence or for your own understanding, Beethoven was a composer that was kind of in both periods. He was in the classical period, and then he ushered in a new period called the Romantic period. Like other composers like Bach and Mozart, he was very stubborn. There is a famous quote by Beethoven when one of his patrons, a prince, was saying, you have to. I didn't like the music. He didn't like the music that Beethoven was composing, and he asked him to change it. And Beethoven famously said, "There are thousands of princes, but there is only one Beethoven." So he was a very stubborn, difficult person to deal with, but he was a genius, and like most geniuses, he knew what he wanted, and he got what he wanted, and so that was that. All right, so I just want to make a little comparison. You can see from the pictures the Baroque Concerto Grosso is, you can see it's much smaller, the Concerto Grosso. It's a small group of instruments, and so it's an orchestra, you can see, plus a small group of instruments, usually a cello and a keyboard instrument like a harpsichord, and they go back and forth. So remember, in the Baroque period, we listened to the Brandenburg concertos, and those are examples of Concerto Grossos. It's a much smaller group of instruments. And the classical concerto is not a concerto grosso. It's just called a concerto. It's actually just one solo instrument. You can see from the picture below, there's a piano, and surrounding it is the orchestra. And there's like communication between the orchestra and the piano. So that is how kind of the concerto grosso in the Baroque period was a little bit different than the concerto in the classical period. And then eventually, as we said, Haydn was one of the first composers that would compose for large-scale symphonies. So they developed what was called the symphony orchestra. So orchestra is kind of like, there's no set organization of an orchestra. You can have a string orchestra, or you can have different kinds of organizations. But a symphony orchestra is a set number and organization of orchestra, where you see, if you look at the picture here, you can see the violins on the left. There's a small group of violins, and at the very front there's the head violin, and then in the middle there are some violas, and on the right you see the cellos, and then behind them in the next row you see the woodwinds, the flutes on the left, and the oboe, and then the deeper instruments, the deeper woodwinds on the right, and then on the very far right you can see the brass instruments, because they're loud and they carry, so they're at the back. And then, of course, on the left you see the percussion or drum instruments. So this is the classical, this is what's called a symphony orchestra, and Haydn started composing symphonies. He was one of the earliest composers of symphonies. As I said, he wrote over 100 symphonies, and then Mozart wrote several symphonies as well. And then when we hit Beethoven, Beethoven was a private composer. He composed these huge concerts, so he didn't have to compose as many. So he only wrote 9 symphonies. And it was from Beethoven's time afterwards that composers didn't write nearly as much as earlier composers did. So Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies, yes. So please, example 5, you can hear the Emperor Concerto. The example is with Evgeny Kishin. And you can hear from example 5 there's this kind of conversation between the piano and the orchestra. And this is a Piano Concerto Number 5, one of Beethoven's most famous piano concerto. As I said, Mozart made the piano concerto popular, and then following this, Beethoven wrote several piano concertos as well. And this is a very good example. So please listen to example number 5. And then in example number 6, we're going to talk about the symphony. As I said, Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies. This is the second movement of the 7th symphony. And this is a kind of an example of how Beethoven, I think, moves to a more romantic style. You can hear this repeating kind of bass, do, 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 and then it layers and it builds in intensity and strength. And so, although it is written in sonata form, you can see elements of the romantic style. So you can see how Beethoven is kind of, again, he learned the rules, he composed like Haydn and Mozart, but it's not enough for him. He wants to develop his own kind of style, and this brings about a whole new era of music in the Romantic period. So just to give you a review of musical forms, I think every period of music that we studied had a kind of dominant musical form that was prevalent during the period. So I think in the Middle Ages we had the motet, and in the Renaissance you talked about madrigals and chansons. And in the Baroque period, I think the dominant, there were several different kinds of song forms, but the fugue, Bach's fugue, was one of the most famous ones. And in the fugue, there was a repeating melody that occurred in different voices, and that melody didn't change, just repeated over and over and over again, and there would be a melody and a counter melody. Whereas in the classical period, as I said before, instead of a melody, we have motifs, and motifs tend to change throughout the piece in a certain structure. So there's an introduction of the motif and some changes to the motif in the exposition, and then in the recapitulation, that motif is repeated, and then the piece is over. So these are the different song forms that are experienced that come out of these periods. Okay, so let me give you a review of the 18th century. So the Enlightenment philosophers, based after Louis XIV spent all the money, and the taxes got really, really bad for the local people in France, and there were similar situations, circumstances in America at the time. There were these French philosophers that basically said we need to change things. They re-questioned. Why is there a king? What is the purpose of government? All people should be equal, and these ideas of equality and freedom also express themselves in art. And there was a kind of a return to the classical ideas and simplicity of the Greek times. So that's why they call it neo. Neo means new. The neoclassical period. And that's why they call this period the classical period, because there was a return to simple and clear ideas of the Greeks. In terms of music, we have genres such as the symphony developing out of this period, the string quartet. Both of them are written in sonata form. And how these genres are different, or how classical music is different, is we see this kind of influence of or emphasis on homophony and this development of motifs rather than melodies. Okay, I hope that you understood everything. So after you finish this, based on your notes, I would like you to, I'm going to give you a link on Manaba, and based on that link, I'd like you to take a test that will test you to see if you understand things. We won't have time, because this is an on-demand assignment, we won't have time to interact with each other, so I'm going to give you a test, and hopefully by answering the questions, it'll help reinforce your understanding of these ideas. So please make sure you put your name and your student number in the test so that I know that you, and make sure you like this video if you can, so that I can know that you watched it. Okay? Thank you very much.